why there are Quakers in the Piedmont, North Carolina. Aren't they supposed to be up in Pennsylvania or Indiana? But few people realize that one of the largest concentrations of Quakers in America is actually right here in Piedmont, North Carolina. And the history goes back before the founding of the United States of America. There, of course, were large Quaker communities in the north, especially in the Delaware Valley. But it was getting crowded up there in the 1700s. There were wars. Land was getting expensive. There was land you couldn't buy for less than 5 cents an acre. It was pricey. So Quakers began migrating down the old Philadelphia Wagon Road through the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia into Piedmont, North Carolina in the 1740s and 50s for several reasons. One was land was available. It was the back country. But more importantly, it wasn't under the control of the Church of England. And Quakers as nonconformists needed an area where they could worship freely in their own non-creedal, non-sacramental way. And the North Carolina backcountry beckoned. So down they came in large numbers and joined later on from that area of the Delaware Valley by Quakers from Nantucket, which was a largely Quaker community of whalers. And that island was getting crowded, and the whales were moving far offshore. So those Quakers joined the Quaker DNA from Pennsylvania and coming down here. And that's very important in understanding the nature of the Quaker community here, because those two communities in the 1700s were two of the primary locations of anti-slavery sentiment among Quakers in America. In 1688, in Germantown, Pennsylvania, now a neighborhood of Philadelphia, but at the time it was a town north of Philadelphia established by Quaker refugees from Germany. Four Quakers in Germantown gathered in 1688, appalled by the fact they had recently discovered that Quakers in America owned slaves, which they found totally inconsistent with the Sermon on the Mount, with Jesus' clear teaching that you don't do to other people what you wouldn't have done to you, the golden rule. They had escaped persecution in Germany, and they said, what on earth are Quakers doing involved with slavery? And so in 1688, these four Quakers from that community penned what is known as the Germantown Remonstrance. It's a one-page document that simply starts off with the golden rule. Would any of us like to be enslaved? No. Why would we do that to others? Well, in Quaker polity, decisions are made by gathering a sense of the community. Everyone has to agree in Quaker polity before you make a decision. Either everyone has to agree, or everyone has to agree not to agree, or people have to agree, I may not believe that, but I will stand aside because I sense that the larger community believes this. So for Quakers in America to agree not to be involved with slavery takes a long process of convincement. So from those four Quakers penning in 1688 the Germantown Remonstrance, it bubbles through Quaker decision-making at the local level, the larger level, and eventually the national level of trying to convince everyone slavery is wrong and we need to get out of it. And by the early 1700s, there were significant Quakers in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, like Anthony Benezet, Benjamin Lay, John Woolman, who are picking up this concern and in stronger and stronger terms working on convincing the wider Society of Friends and the wider community outside of the Society of Friends, Quakers, that slavery was wrong. By the 1750s, Quakers in Pennsylvania and elsewhere in the North had determined that Quakers can no longer be involved in buying, importing enslaved persons. And by 1776, had decided you can't be a Quaker and be involved in slavery in any way, shape, or form. Those were the Quakers who came down here to North Carolina. So they came out of this area where this concern had been bubbling up for decades and had resulted in some of the most dramatic anti-slavery actions, guerrilla theater even, in America. I've got to tell the story of Benjamin Lay. There's a wonderful book that's just been written by a history professor at the University of Pittsburgh, Marcus Rediker, called The Remarkable Benjamin Lay. And it chronicles this wonderful person who I love to do role play on in my classes at Guilford College when we were talking about this. Benjamin Lay was a dwarf, 4-foot-tall dwarf hunchback who lived in a house in the side of a hill north of Philadelphia, giving rise to the legend that he, like a hobbit, lived in a cave, radical vegetarian, who'd been a sailor for 17 years and had witnessed the Middle Passage. He was born in the late 1600s and spent time in Barbados, observing slave plantations and the horrors of human chattel slavery, and became, by the 1720s, staunch opponent of slavery. Could not convince other Quakers about this. He certainly was sympathetic with the Germantown Remanstance folk, but was recognizing that it wasn't gaining traction. And he kept trying to convince people slavery was wrong, and they just weren't listening because, Quakers, among the first in with Pennsylvania, owned land. They were wealthy. They owned slaves at a larger percentage than most other people because it was an economic system. Slavery was an economic system that made people wealthy. And it's hard to convince people to give that up. So finding that his talking about the evils of slavery wasn't convincing anything, he started doing guerrilla theater. One of my favorites was he came into an assembly of Quakers, again, trying to convince them it's time for us to give up slavery. And they said, well, we can't really come to a consensus about this. It's too grave. Let's table it for another year. Talk some more. He said, that's it. So storms out. Comes back in a few minutes later. His gray Quaker overcoat covering a military uniform. He throws off the gray Quaker overcoat, revealing this military uniform with the brass buttons and, importantly, a sword in a scabbard at his side. He's carrying a Bible in the crook of his arm. He pulls the sword out, plunges it into this Bible, and yells out, "Not to end slavery is like plunging a sword through the very heart of the gospel." He had hollowed out that Bible and filled it with a pig's bladder full of red berry juice, so the blood splattered everybody. Very symbolic act of the violence of slavery and the dissection of Jesus' gospel, of the Sermon on the Mount. And of course, he's tossed out, he's disowned, discredited. But it kicks the door in for later folk like Anthony Benson and John Woolman with gentler techniques and tactics to finally drag the Society Friends kicking and screaming into anti-slavery activism. That's the root out of which the Quakers who settled the Piedmont came. So those Pennsylvania Quakers and those Nantucket Quakers, the Swains, the Coffins, the Macys, were staunch opponents of slavery by the time they got here. So there's a large community of Quakers by the 1770s here in Piedmont, North Carolina. They're opposed to slavery. They're living in a slave culture. So they have to deal with a whole variety of issues, one of which is not just ending slavery among themselves, but once they do that, recognizing that the wider culture is engaged in dehumanization in so many different ways. So along with starting manumission societies, trying to convince others to end slavery, they are recognizing that those who have already been freed free blacks, are readily kidnapped and sold back into slavery. And this becomes a huge issue that Quakers get involved with. One of the most famous cases is 1817. A free black by the name of Benjamin Benson is living in Delaware. And he is kidnapped and sold into slavery to John Thompson, not the basketball coach, but a businessman here in Greensboro. And 3 Quakers in the New Garden community, which was the primary community of Quakers here in the Piedmont. George Swain, Vestal Coffin, and Enoch Macy, all 3 of them Nantucket Quakers. Macy's, of course, the department store folk. And they become aware of the fact that Benjamin Benson is claiming his rights in the court here in Greensboro. And they go to bat for him. And they support him. And they know all the legal maneuvers about this because they helped start the first Manumission Society in North Carolina. They've petitioned the legislature. They know the law, and they are willing to do whatever they can to support Benjamin Benson. Well, John Thompson gets spooked, realizes he could lose his investment. So he sells Benjamin Benson to a person in Georgia. And Benson is taken off into slavery in Georgia. Well, Macy, Coffin, and Swain go to Georgia and support him and argue for him. And the judge here in Greensboro eventually gets Benson extradited, brought back here. And in 1820, Benson gains his freedom in the legal system, one of the first instances of a black person in America using the legal system to gain their freedom. It's not the end of it for those 3 either, because Vestal Coffin, in 1819, the year before Benson is finally freed, becomes known as the first conductor on the Underground Railroad here in not only in Guilford County, but probably North Carolina, possibly in America. This is a decade or more before the whole system of helping people escape slavery into free states and into Canada becomes known as the Underground Railroad, because they hadn't invented railroads yet in 1819. And Swain goes on to help others, like an enslaved person named Stephen, who's also a free black and was kidnapped. And Swain actually then goes on to head up the Colonization Society, one of the techniques, one of the methods that Quakers and others used to get around the legal prohibition against freeing slaves or being involved in illegal activities like the Underground Railroad, and finding passage for those willing to go to Haiti or the Caribbean or Liberia to colonize those areas as free people. Swain becomes the president of that society in Guilford County until he realizes that that's not working either, because they are readily re-enslaved, kidnapped, sold back into slavery, and the situation in Haiti and Liberia isn't great. So he leaves that and, again, continues his involvement in the Underground Railroad. Manumission Society is an organization that seeks to convince people to free enslaved persons. So it's not like the Underground Railroad. It's an attempt to convince people that slavery is wrong and that people who are involved in slavery own other human beings as slaves should free them. So it's an effort at convincing. Anti-slavery societies tend to take other methods, and of course the Underground Railroad is just an illegal underground activity. It's heck with the rest of it. We're just going to get these people out of here. The Coffin family is quite famous for their involvement in the Underground Railroad. The Coffins were one of those Nantucket Quaker surnames. Many people in America know Lucretia Coffin Mott. Lucretia Mott, born in Nantucket, gained fame as a women's suffrage advocate, working for women's rights to vote. She's an advocate for Native American rights. She petitioned Ulysses S. Grant in the White House to do more for Indian rights. and quite famously was also involved in anti-slavery work. Her cousins, Coffins like Vestal Coffin, William Coffin, and especially Levi Coffin, were well-known anti-slavery advocates, not only because of their local work, but nationally. Levi Coffin, who was born here in Guilford County in 1798 and moved to Indiana with his family in 1826, became known as the president of the Underground Railroad. He doesn't designate himself as that. That was kind of how he was known, because he and his wife Catherine enabled between 2,000 and 3,000 fugitives from slavery to go through their home in Indiana to freedom. It became known as the Grand Central Station of the Underground Railroad. They operated a free labor store in their home just north of Richmond, Indiana, where they sold free labor goods, textiles, other products that weren't tainted by slavery. Went bankrupt because expensive stuff. So they moved to Cincinnati in the 1840s for a larger market and opened up a free labor store there that also went bankrupt later on. But in Cincinnati in the 1850s, they became acquainted with a young novelist by the name of Harriet Beecher Stowe. And Harriet Beecher Stowe winds up writing this novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, and the Coffin family, Levi and Catherine Coffin, become, under a different name, central figures, Quakers involved in the Underground Railroad in that novel. So Levi Coffin had quite a reputation, along with his wife Catherine. Their home, still standing in now Fountain City, Indiana, is a National Historic Landmark. And one of 3 known false bottom wagons used in the Underground Railroad is there in their old barn. I got to tell a story of Levi Coffin and the false bottom wagon. Of course, Levi Coffin and his wife Catherine absolutely committed to anti-slavery work and activity on the Underground Railroad, but they're also good Quakers, and you're not supposed to lie. You're not supposed to use violence. There's the peace testimony. There's a testimony of integrity, but there's also this testimony against slavery and integrity and the light of God in everyone. So there's a commitment to equality. So what do you do when all of those come into conflict? And one of the great stories I like to tell of Coffin was one day he was transporting 2 guests, as they called them, 2 fugitives from slavery in this false bottom wagon. There's one right here at the Mendenhall home place in Jamestown that people can still see, just south of Greensboro. And there's a compartment underneath the main cargo bay of this specially built wagon where you can hide passengers on the Underground Railroad and then put whatever your cargo is on top of it. It looks like just a regular wagon. Well, Levi Coffin's clip-clopping up the road from their home there in Indiana to the next station on the Underground Railroad with 2 guests in this false bottom compartment. And a slave chaser stops him. Doesn't have the papers to search the wagon, but figures, okay, a Quaker has got to answer a question honestly. You're not supposed to lie. And so the slave chaser, as the story is told, said, okay, Coffin, I know what you're up to. What are you really carrying in the bottom of that wagon? Well, that day, providentially, he had a bunch of clay pots and straw in the cargo bay. Coffin looks back at his cargo bay, can't betray his fugitives from slavery, but also can't lie, and simply responds, earthen vessels. I'm just carrying earthen vessels. Which clay pots are, but so are we. And there are all kinds of stories like that. My own ancestors were conductors on the Underground Railroad up in Indiana. They had left the South like most Quakers had in the early 1800s to escape the slave culture here and went to free states. And great-great-grandpa Robert Cooke and Elizabeth Johnson operated a station on the Underground Railroad near where I grew up in Indiana. And they had a family of fugitives from slavery in their home. It was just after supper time, and Grandma was tending to this group, getting ready for them to go to the next station on the Underground Railroad, which happened to be our Uncle Jimmy Stanley's house. Well, Grandpa was downstairs. There's a knock on the door, and there's the slave chaser and the magistrate. They got papers, and they've got a legal right to search the house. And they confront Grandpa, and Grandpa, again, what do? You can't pull a 30-06 off the wall and blow them away. That would violate one Quaker testimony. He's not supposed to lie, but he can't betray the folk upstairs. So he says, well, if you'll stay here in the parlor while my wife puts the children to bed, you can search the house. But right now, if she's putting the children to bed, you might disturb us. So wait here, and then you search the house. Well, Grandma hears this, scurries about, gets the guests out through the second floor window on the back porch roof. They shimmy down the poles, through the barnyard, through the pasture field to the woods in safety. And Grandma then tucks the children in bed and yells down, the children are in bed now, they send our guests up. Well, they didn't lie. They didn't use violence, but didn't betray their guests. Keeping those balls in the air was tough stuff. It didn't always work, but it was important enough to maintain the fidelity, each of those values and principles, that they made the effort. Another story about Levi Coffin I want to tell related to how they used appeals to religion to provide opportunities for enslaved persons. Now, in the South at that time, religion was interpreted by white slave owners in a way a little inconsistent with how Quakers interpreted the gospel and Jesus' teachings. The Bible was used to justify slavery. Those pieces of the Bible, Paul's instructions to Onesimus to return to his slave owner, slavery in the Hebrew scriptures were used to justify it. There were even some slave Bibles that, kind of like a Thomas Jefferson Bible, excised those passages that would have talked about liberation, like the Exodus. That was missing from some slave Bibles. And Levi Coffin, as he grew up, there are so many other stories that I can tell about him and Vestal and the other Coffins, but he became a teacher in his early 20s in the little Quaker school in the New Garden community. And in 1821, he went to some area slave owners, non-Quakers, but Quakers had given up slavery in North Carolina by 1778. They approached other slave owners like David and Rachel Caldwell and asked them if they would be willing to let their enslaved persons learn how to read the Bible in their little Quaker schoolhouse that wasn't being used on Sunday afternoons. It was known as a Sabbath school. And his argument was, you receive benefit from reading the Bible, moral instruction, it improves your life. How would you deny your enslaved persons this moral education and the improvement in their personhood from reading the Bible? And it's, sure. Well, it's the backdoor way to teach literacy at a time when that was illegal. You could not teach enslaved persons how to read. You didn't want them reading maps. You didn't want them reading The Liberator. You didn't want them reading about Nat Turner and Denmark, BC. But this is the backdoor way to teaching literacy. And it was so effective that within a few months of opening that school in 1821, other less progressive slave owners shut that school down, claiming it was making their enslaved persons restless. And if you look at the marker where that school stood, now in the New Garden graveyard, there's a marker there commemorating that. And there's a list of the teachers in that school. And a whole bunch of those teachers wound up in Indiana because they had to get the heck out of the slave culture. Levi Coffin Horace Cannon, Jeremiah Hubbard, Elijah Coffin. But one of the names that isn't known enough in this community is Vestal Coffin. He was the first cousin to Levi Coffin. Had Vestal lived past his 34th birthday, he died on his birthday, October 10th, 1826, the same year that Levi and his family left for Indiana. Vestal probably would have been better known in American history for anti-slavery work than his cousin Levi. Levi lived to be 78 or 79, but Vestal died of consumption in 1826. Well, we've already talked earlier in our conversation about Vestal Coffin's involvement with Benjamin Benson. He was one of those three who helped Benjamin Benson argue for his freedom in the courts as a free black in 1820. Well, in 1819, Vestal Coffin was already well known in this community for having helped establish the first Manumission Society in North Carolina, for having argued and petitioned the North Carolina legislature to end slavery, staunch advocate against slavery, and just a simple dirt farmer whose 170-acre farm is where the Jefferson Standard Country Club used to be, where Temple Emmanuel, the late lamented American Hebrew Academy, and Target Shopping Center are now located. That was his and Alethia's farm. And in 1819, another free black by the name of John Dimrey, married with children, living in southern North Carolina, realizes, yeah, I am a free black, I've got my papers, but I am vulnerable. Yeah, he probably knew about the Benjamin Benson case. He knew how often free blacks were being kidnapped and sold into slavery. And he moved with his family into the New Garden community for that extra layer of protection of being surrounded by a Quaker community. Well, one night in 1819, after his former owner had died, his former owner's sons decide, we're going to reclaim our property, our inheritance. And they find out where John Dimrey's cabin is in the New Garden community. Late one night, the winter of 1819, come riding into the community, ride up horseback to the Dimrey cabin and call him out, claiming to have been out hunting and gotten lost. And Dimrey steps outside the cabin door and he's immediately jumped, tied up with ropes, and he's going to be hauled off. Well, he yells to, well, initially his wife comes out to see what's happening. She's knocked unconscious by these guys. His oldest daughter comes running out and he says, run, get Vestal Coffin. Well, she dashes through the night, gets Vestal Coffin, who just stepped outside of his house to get some firewood, drops his load of firewood, doesn't even grab a winter coat, and goes dashing through the, grabs another Quaker neighbor and follows her to intercept these kidnappers. Well, Vestal knows the law. He's done this with Benjamin Benson. He says, I know exactly how to prosecute you guys. You're in trouble. I will prosecute you to the full extent of the law. They get spooked, don't know quite what to do, and the guy that Vestal Coffin is picked up on the way sneaks around behind John Dimrey, unties his ropes, and Dimrey springs into the woods with bloodhounds following him. And he stops, claps his hands, and yells at the dogs, and they get spooked, and he makes his escape. Well, the kidnappers get spooked too, and they turn tail and skedaddle out of there. And later on that night, Vestal Coffin and John Dimrey get together in the Coffin cabin and map his way to freedom in Indiana, knowing that he can't stay there. They'll be back. And so the route that he maps out for Dimrey is essentially the route that Quakers were taking up over the Blue Ridge Mountains, up to Charlottesville, West Virginia, now West Virginia, then Virginia, along the Kanawha River to the Ohio River, and by foot or by steamer up through Cincinnati to Richmond, Indiana, which was a Quaker town established by 3 Quakers from Randolph County in 1806, one of whom, David Hoover, was the ancestor of Herbert Hoover, the president. And so 6 weeks later by foot, John Dimrey arrives in this Quaker town of Richmond, Indiana, spends 2 years there working and earning enough money to send for his family, who eventually joined him 2 years later. So 1819, and this year, 2019, is the bicentennial of this. First passenger, first conductor on the Underground Railroad that we know of in North Carolina, right here in what's now Greensboro. Quaker involvement in anti-slavery and concern for people of color, like enslaved persons in the 1700s and 1800s, was not an isolated incident. It was part of a broader concern that Quakers had for humanity. And that comes from a core Quaker theological principle that there is that of God in everyone. Everyone has an inward light, a light that's from God, that is the presence of God or of Christ, if you're a Christian, in every person, regardless of race, creed, color, nationality, religion, or non-religion. So from the very beginning of Quakerism in the 1650s in England, Quakers advocated for those who broader society saw as less than human, or savages, because Quakers said, no, there's that light of God in them. And as George Fox, one of the founders of Quakerism, said, our duty as Christians is to walk cheerfully over the world, answering that of God in everyone, and connecting with others. The divinity in me addresses the divinity in you. Fox himself, in 1671, made a visit to the Carolinas. I don't know why, with the mountains and the Piedmont and all the wonderful places in North Carolina he chose to go, he went to the Great Dismal Swamp in Perquimans and Pasquotank counties. But that's where there were Quakers who had settled there to hide out from persecution in New England, where it was a capital offense to be Quaker. You could be hanged for being Quaker in New England into the 1660s. So, like Maroons, Quakers hid out in the Great Dismal Swamp. And Fox comes and is splashing through the Great Dismal. And who's guiding him through the Great Dismal? Native Americans. He takes sick. Who nurses him back to health? Native Americans. And he writes in his journal about this experience. He says, here are people that others call savages, and they have guided me gently and lovingly through the Great Dismal Swamp. When I took sick, they took care of me and cured me with their medicinals. And we would talk, and I would ask them through an interpreter about important spiritual values. And one of the things he records in his journal is, when you do wrong, is there that within you which convicts you? And they said, yeah. Well, what do you call that? And they gave the Indian name for it. Fox said, here's what we call it. It's the same thing. And then he contrasts that. Here are these savages who have the same conscience and the same light in their consciences that he experienced, who had taken care of him. And he contrasts that with the Christians up in New England who were killing Quakers. Well, that is part and parcel of that Quaker attitude that is probably better known in American history in the actions of William Penn. William Penn, a Quaker convert, in 1681-82, is given a grant of land that's now known as Pennsylvania by King Charles II, because Penn's father had been an admiral in the King's Navy and had loaned a lot of money to Charles II's father in the prosecution of all those wars. And after Admiral Penn died, Charles II decides to pay off the debt by giving William Penn a grant of land that he just stolen from the Native Americans. Well, Penn says, I can't accept it. You don't own it. I don't own it. The only way that I will inhabit it, and again, remember, Quakers are persecuted. They're a persecuted minority in England. Wouldn't it be great to have this Quaker colony where Quakers could escape persecution? Penn refuses to accept it and says, instead, I will send my agents over. They will meet with Native Americans and agree on how we will live together. And in 1682, Penn himself goes to Pennsylvania, meets with Native Americans along with his agents, and they agree on how Penn will purchase the land that the King of England has supposedly given him. And he not only purchases it from the Lenape, the Delaware, who live right there, Delaware Valley, Philadelphia, but he also buys it from the Iroquois, who had suzerainty over the Lenape. And then he goes ahead and learns the Indian language, learns their customs, and before he becomes the portly Quaker that people associate with the Quaker Oats box, runs in their contests, and he's evidently a great 100-yard dash man. They probably used metrics back then. But, fully engages himself in Indian culture to learn from them, to respect them. His famous phrase, when people said, you got to be an idiot to go to Pennsylvania, the Indians will kill you. He says, well, let's now try what love will do. And that becomes a phrase that Quakers continue to use down to this day. And it's the motto of the American Friends Service Committee. Let us now try what love will do. Well, that becomes part of an oral iconography. Quakers are non-creedal. He tells stories. I remember one time, I don't want to step on anybody's toes, so I won't name the church here in Greensboro, but I was asked by a major church, major mainline denomination here in Greensboro, to come be a part of their Sunday school series on how different denominations, different religions determine their ethics. And so I attended their coffee Sunday school class, and I told stories of, about Levi Coffin, about Vestal Coffin, about Quakers on Underground Road, Quakers and Indians, and said, this is how Quakers determine their ethics. We tell the stories of what Quakers have done in the past, and that informs how we operate today. And so after telling several of these stories related to the Underground Railroad here in Greensboro, I turned to these folks and said, so what stories does your denomination tell? And there was a long silence, which as a Quaker I was very comfortable with. And then one person piped up tongue-in-cheek and said, well, we exchange stock tips around coffee. So Quakers tell stories to communicate our values and our ethics and our principles. And those stories inspire us about the commitment and the sacrifices that previous generations have made, and holds up a model for us for behavior. How ought I behave today when there are people being dehumanized? I don't want to get too political, but we continue in 2019 to describe the other as less than human, as savages, as criminals, as rapists, as less than, as dangerous, to be feared. And in the back of our heads are these stories of here's how our ancestors behaved. Here's how people in Greensboro, in the Piedmont, behaved. Countercultural, nonconformist. The broader culture said these people are less than. These people can be used economically. They don't deserve to be treated as fully human. The back of our minds are these tapes rolling saying, no, that's not consistent with our best values, with our best selves. And there's a direct line from the Coffins and the Macy's and the Mendenhalls and those Quakers and others Wesleyan Methodists, Free Methodists, Presbyterians, Unitarians, so many others involved in this kind of work in the 1700s and 1800s. In a massive interracial civil disobedience movement that preceded what happened here in the Woolworths in 1960 by almost 200 years. So there's this history, there's this commitment. That's part of who we are and the stories we tell. And if you look at local history in the 1940s and the 1950s, that's what led Quakers and others here to seek desegregation of the schools. In the 1960s to work in the civil rights movement, right up until this time, when there's so many other issues that we can be involved with. We got to tell those stories.
Systematic life.